Okay, hi guys. So today I'm going to be talking around this book. This is User Story Mapping by Jeff Patton, and I read this over the summer. And it's an amazing book. It's really good. And it's about three things really. It's actually really three books in one. There's about a third of it is about user story mapping, which is like a UX design technique for mapping out user journeys and getting everyone on the same page. And then there's a third of it which is about discovery and delivery in the way that Marty Caden talks about. So it's kind of lots of recipes for how to run various meetings and workshops and how to do discovery and delivery effectively. And then a third of it is a bit kind of, it's a bit odd, and it's kind of a collection of stories. Well, it's funny, it's a collection of stories about stories. And I think there's a phrase in here somewhere which is like it's almost the story behind stories. And I found that to actually be the most interesting part of the book. Because I think stories are something which we kind of all work with on a daily basis, but if you ask them what's a story, you get lots and lots of different answers. And so Jeff's got some really interesting ideas about what really is a story, and he seems to know his stuff, and he references people like Kent Beck, who were kind of, and the Agile founders who kind of started off this whole business about stories. So what I want to talk about is the three C's, right? So Jeff talks about card, conversation. Card, conversation, and confirmation.
You're just off screen, Simrun.
Is that off screen?
Yeah. Slightly up.
Yeah?
Yeah, that was good.
Confirmation. So that's the bottom of my screen. Okay. So in the start of this book, Jeff says, well, if there's only two things you should take away from the whole book, it's these two things. And one of them is that stories are about telling, not about writing down. Which is kind of a controversial thing to say, because we always think about, we always write stories, and we think of books and stories as being written. But that's really at the heart of what Jeff's talking about. So when he says conversation, when he says stories are about telling, or for telling and not for writing down, what does he mean? And he gives some examples. So he references this book, actually, which we actually have a physical copy of in the office. And you may be wondering why this is in the office. This book is called Cake Rex. It's by Jen Yates. And you can see on the front, it's a collection of when professional cakes go hilariously wrong. And it's a collection of like cakes that are all messed up, basically. And on the front, it says, there's a cake here, and it says, "Best wishes, Suzanne. Underneath that, we will miss you." And so Jeff says, well, this is a perfect example of what he calls shared documentation not equal to shared understanding. So what's happened here? So whoever's ordered this cake for Suzanne, has his Suzanne's friend. They've got some sort of form, and they've written out, here's what I wanted to say. I want it to have to be vanilla flavored and have flowers on it, and I wanted to say, "Best wishes, Suzanne. Underneath that, we will miss you." And then Suzanne's friend has handed it to the baker or the cake maker, and they've read the document and said, "Okay, I know what that means. Here's your cake." And that's how you end up with, a cake that is pretty hilarious, but it's not really what you ordered in case it's going to be expensive, right? And so Jeff points out that we play this all the time. We play this kind of game with Chinese whispers all the time when we're trying to work together. And you can think about, really long chains of people where, someone has an idea or someone sees a problem, and that gets communicated and written down, and then it gets read by a product manager, and then they try and tell it to somebody, and by the time you actually end up with a cake, it's very different to what we originally imagined. And yeah, this is funny in the case of cakes, but when we're as product managers in charge of putting whole teams to sprint for 2 weeks, and that's a very expensive thing to get wrong. And I guess to take it to an extreme, there's the famous story about NASA where they launched a rocket where something should have been 2 inches long and it was 2 centimeters long, and the whole thing exploded. So then it becomes really actually quite tragic, more than just expensive. So what's the solution to this? So what's happened in this case then is Suzanne's friend has got this idea, okay, this is what I want. in my head. I want a triangle, and that's in her head. And she's written down, this is a silly example. She's written that down, and this document's been given to the baker, and the baker's read that and said, "Oh, I know exactly what you mean. So you're looking for one of these, right? Like a square." And Suzanne said, "Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I read this. I know what you mean. Cool." And they both go away, and everything's great until you get a square, not a triangle. So what Jeff says is, well, there's a really obvious solution to this. Why don't we get, instead of, these people might not even ever talk to each other, right? But why don't we get Suzanne and the baker in the same room, we give them a whiteboard, and we say to Suzanne, why don't you just draw on the board what you want? Well, this is not Suzanne, this is Suzanne's friend, because it's best wishes Suzanne. We'll call Suzanne's friend Katie. So this is Katie, and this is the baker. So Katie writes about, I want that. Oh, and the baker's, oh, hang on a minute, that's actually going to be really difficult to make. Why don't we make it more like that? And Katie goes, oh, that's not really what I wanted, that's actually not quite right. And so we say, well, actually, why don't we do something like that? That's actually really easy to make. And Katie says, well, you can actually make a cake, which is like that. And the baker says, yeah, and it's actually really easy. So they can both see that. Now they've both got this, they've got a circle in their heads. And they know they're on the same page, and the baker goes away, makes a cake, and the cake is great, right? Now what Neil's going to say to me is, well, this is all very well and good, but in real life, you can't just go around chatting to everyone and then remember everything, and then, it doesn't scale, right? So if our shared documentation is not going to be written down, because we kind of know, we can see lots of examples where you might write something down, it makes perfect sense to you, you give it to someone else, they read it, it makes perfect sense to them, and yet they interpret it in a different way. If we're not going to do that, then what are we going to do? And this is where Jeff introduces another analogy. I really like Jeff's writing because he uses lots and lots of visual analogies, and it makes things really easy to remember. So he says, well, okay, we've all got these smartphones, right? So let's take a picture of the whiteboard. Let's store that somewhere over here. We'll get to this in a minute in our kind of card. And then in the future, when we need to remember, well, what was that conversation all about? Anyone who was in the room can look at that and instantly remember, I remember that conversation. We couldn't do that, and we couldn't do that, but we chose this. And Jeff calls these holiday snaps, or vacation photos in his words. So this is you probably can't see this very well, but I was in Oxford last weekend, and I took a lovely photo of, it's a quad in Oxford with a lovely tended grass and flowers around the edges, right? Anyone could look at that and see that. But actually only me and the person I was with, Jesse, could tell you what we had for lunch that day, some lovely sandwiches in the sun, that we went punting, that we paid £30 for the punt, got £8 deposit back, that it started raining at 6 p.m, that we met up with them, so there's a whole story behind this photo that we only know because we were there. And in the same way, what Jeff says is, if you do this kind of really visual work and you draw diagrams and you draw pictures and you take videos and then you record that by taking photos of it, for example, then everyone who's involved in that process has a really, really rich understanding of that. And if all it takes is a few photos for them to look at and remember, oh, okay, that's what we were talking about, and get back there. So that's what Jeff means when he says holiday snaps or vacation photos. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean when we get to build, we're going to give the engineers a bunch of photos. We'll get onto that in a minute. But what it does mean is that we're getting everybody on the same page and recording it in such a way that we are really trying to build shared understanding. So at the heart of this is the idea that if as a team we can all get on the same page in a really effective way, then we're less likely to end up making the wrong cake. So that's conversation for now. We'll come back to conversation in a bit. Let's look at cards. So one really, really interesting part of this book, which I read, was a description of the Atlassian offices. So for anyone who doesn't know, Atlassian are one of the leading developers of tools to help developers. So they build Jira, which is a huge digital issue tracking system. They build Confluence, which is a huge digital wiki. And loads and loads of teams use this to manage their work. But I'll read a passage from this. It says, when I walk around the Atlassian office in Sydney, I see the walls covered with sticky notes, whiteboard drawings, and screen wireframes. So that's interesting. So this company that literally makes tools, digital tools for collaboration, actually, their walls are still covered in sticky notes and old school drawings. And it says if you look closely, you'll see that the sticky notes reference ticket numbers in Jira. So even though they've got, in their ticket tracking system, all the information is there, actually they're still covering their walls in it. That's really interesting. It's kind of a tangential topic called information radiators, but I'll leave you guys to think about that. And he says, when Sharif showed me what they keep in Confluence, which is their wiki software, I'm amazed at the combination of photographs, short videos, and discussions that are found in there. So what he's saying is actually, this guy Jeff went and visited Atlassian in Australia and found that they were doing exactly this. And I think there's a point here, which is that it's really easy to use some of these tools to, you can always write a Word document, a long Word document, and upload it somewhere and not talk to anyone because you're using a computer all day. And assume that everyone understands. But the people who make these tools are using it in this way, where they're talking to each other all the time, they're drawing lots of diagrams, they're taking lots of photos, and they're putting them all in their wiki. And the walls of their offices are covered in these cards, which have numbers on them that reference all this digital information that's stored there. So the really cool thing about these tools is that we can store like an infinite amount of really, really, really rich information about like what we're working on and reference it all from these ticket numbers. So that's really, really cool. So this is one way in which Jeff suggests we can use conversations to be much more effective in the way we work, and that's by getting on the same page and remembering it and being able to recall all that information really, really easily, without spending. I guess an extreme alternative would be to say, well, perhaps if we'd had a few more hundred pages of documentation, the rocket wouldn't have exploded, right? But how much documentation do we need? Perhaps there are more effective ways. The other way in which we can use conversation is to help us stay really focused in our work. So let's take an example where, as a product manager, we're tasked with hitting a certain business goal, right? So we might start off a story or a card by saying, by trying to frame an opportunity, like a really high-level business problem. And Jeff and also Marty Kagan both suggest a way of doing this, and they say to focus on who, what, and why. So briefly what this means is focusing on who this piece of work is going to benefit. So for example, that might be, well, I'll give an example afterwards. So it's who this work is going to benefit, what the problem we're trying to solve is, and why we should be the ones to solve this problem. Why is it our business that's doing this? So an example would be who might be users who have not activated their accounts. What might be there's a large drop-off in the onboarding that we see on analytics. And why might be, well, next year one of our goals is to get 100,000 users registered, right? So that's an example of framing a really high-level business problem in this way. And the reason that Jeff says this is so important is because if we frame it like this at the start, then no matter where we get to at the very end, when we finally build something, we should always come back to this and have this as the focus, so that whatever we build, we're always going to hit we're always going to keep the original problem in mind. And he says actually, if you write nothing on if you write nothing else on your ticket, write these things down, attach all the rest of the stuff, and you'll be okay. Without these, then you're almost starting off without a direction. And then he introduces this concept, which I find a really powerful visual metaphor, which is called rock breaking. So, has anyone played asteroids? Yeah. So think about asteroids when you're thinking about this. Yeah. So here's a giant rock, right? A giant asteroid. And this kind of like this example I just outlined is a really, really big problem. So you got a really high level business goal, you want 100,000 registered users. We know there's something wrong with onboarding, but we don't really know what it is. And we don't really know much about these users other than they haven't activated. We don't really know who they are or what their motivation is, right? So we'd say that's like a really big rock. And then what Jeff says is the whole purpose of having conversations, as well as building a shared understanding so that people who actually build this thing understand exactly what the problem was. Another purpose of having these conversations is to break this down into smaller rocks. And what he means by that is, think about this rock as like the whole solution space, right? So this is all the possible things we could build. all the possible solutions we can have for this problem, right? So you're going to have like triangles and squares and circles, and you might have some rough bits and squiggly bits. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to find the little diamonds in there. There might be one little thing we could do or build or create, which is going to give us like, I don't know, £1 million of value. And it might be that actually if we build half of this whole thing, that's also £1 million, but we'd rather build the little diamond, right? We'd rather find it. So he's saying actually, the purpose of having these conversations, as we saw up here, when the baker said to Katie, look, this is a really cool solution, why don't we try this? In the same way, when we're having these conversations with, in our company, people in financial intelligence, our financial analysts, with our engineers, with our designers, what we're really trying to figure out is, well, out of all these possible things that we could build, all the solutions we could build, where are the little diamonds that are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck? And the whole point of writing this who, what, why in the story is so that we can identify these diamonds that are going to have the biggest impact here, and not losing sight of those. So what he said, so we take these diamonds and these are things that we actually want to end up building. And he quotes like there are these famous kind of rules of thumb in software, like 80% of what you build has no impact, 10% actually has a negative impact, and 10% has like a positive impact you were hoping for. So we're looking for like the 10% here. Some people would look at like a giant rock like this and say, that's an epic, that's cool, that's fine. One thing that Jeff warns about is, and I think I perhaps experienced this as well, if you go and talk to somebody about a big rock like this and they say, oh, hang on, this is an epic, come back later when it's smaller, that's really, as you'd say in software, like a smell. That's really that's a symptom of them really saying, I can't help you break this rock down, you need to go and break this down yourself and come back later. Whereas actually, what Jeff talks about is a culture where actually it's the opposite. It's like, whoa, that looks really big and exciting. How can I work with you on this to try and break this down and find out, something that's going to be really small and really valuable for us. So that's something to bear in mind. Okay, so the last part of these three C's, card, conversation, and confirmation. It's confirmation. And Jeff talks about, actually I can't write below this line, so I'm going to write here. Jeff talks about what he calls the three amigos. Three amigos, which is, apparently is a reference to an old Western film, but I haven't seen it, I don't know. And it's also unclear whether there's three or four. So this is one of Jeff, your metaphor kind of breaks down here. I don't know, I didn't really I got the rocks and I got this, but I didn't really get three amigos. He says, okay, as a product manager or a designer, whatever, you've got your gems. Here's your gem, And what he says is, you get your three amigos together. So they're your lead engineer, probably a tester, really important, and maybe a BA or someone, in our company, financial intelligence, someone who like a domain expert, someone who really understands the domain. And if you think about it, like I think a product manager should be a friend as well, but obviously maybe we're not part of the three amigos. I don't know whether we're part of them or not. Who knows? And the job of these guys is to say, well, what if? What about this? What about that? And again, I think there is something in this in saying, actually, if these people are telling you, what about this? What about that? What about this? They're not being difficult. Actually, people like testers are really, really, really good at this. And what they're doing is they're taking this, taking this gem, and they're trying to break it up into tasks that they can actually feed into. We've got this incredible engineering machine where you put these right-sized tasks in, these perfectly formed engineering tasks, and you get working software out the back. That's really awesome, right? So what Jeff says is, confirmation is all about taking these gems and turning them into tasks that we can actually build and work on with really well-defined acceptance criteria. And that's the key. So this is almost where we close the loop in a sense, and where all the stuff that's kind of floating around in people's heads, and we've got a really good understanding of it, but it's perhaps not written down, or actually the understanding is from people looking at photos and diagrams. this is where, with the help of these guys who are actually going to build this thing, thinking about all the edge cases, we write out the acceptance criteria, and get this on a backlog. And then, really, if we're in an awesome company like Wealth Wizards, as soon as it's there with the acceptance criteria on the backlog, it just comes out 2 weeks later as awesome working software, well tested, performance, scalable, all that good stuff. So other words for confirmation are story workshops, or backlog grooming. I really want to emphasize that I think the workshop thing really comes across quite strongly. So sometimes we think of backlog grooming as, we're bringing in a load of stories and then either, well, they're rejected or, okay, this is how long it's going to take to build. Actually, when Jeff talks about this, he really emphasizes this is still a workshop, and at this stage we're working together to look at all the edge cases and write the acceptance criteria and figure out and get it into a state where we're going to build it. And that closes the loop really. So we start with our who, what, and why. Through lots and lots of conversations, we make sure that we're not playing Chinese whispers. We have some really effective ways of working together, so that we spend less time writing stuff that people don't really understand, even though they think they do, and arguing about it, and more time being creative, using visual diagrams, storing that. We use our tools to help us. So we look at the people who make the tools and how they use them. We also use conversations to take us from like really giant, unformed problems into like really targeted, focused, high-impact solutions. And then we work really closely with our testers and our engineers and our BAs, and anyone else who might be an expert, to think about all the edge cases and turn that into a backlog. And this really is, I think where we as product managers probably spend most of our time, or should be spending most of our time, is once we've got that backlog into a state where our engineering team have really, really clear and understood, then it just goes, and that's awesome. So to finish off, Kent Beck, who, I confess I don't know a lot about his work, but he's seen as one of the pioneers in agile development, and he wrote about extreme programming. There's a quote from here. So Jeff emailed Kent Beck and asked him, where did this whole story thing come from? Because Kent's the guy who coined the term stories. And Kent said this. He said, "What I was thinking of was the way users sometimes tell stories about the cool things that software they use does. For example, if I type in the zip code and it automatically fills in the city and state without me having to touch a button, that's really awesome." I think that was the example that triggered the idea. If you can tell stories about what the software does and generate interest and vision in the listener's mind, then why not tell the stories before the software actually does it? So the key point is, the real inspiration for stories was it's supposed to be inspirational. So when you tell a story about how awesome this is going to be in the future, it's supposed to excite the team, it's supposed to excite everyone, and it's supposed to get everyone having these conversations and doing this rock breaking. And I think that's also a key job of us as product managers, is to excite people, excite the team, motivate everyone, and get us working on really awesome stuff. And this is kind of a framework for doing that. Thank you.